I never believed in arranged marriages, until I found myself inside one, standing right inside. My parent had arranged one without my consent. I stood there in front of a man I had never seen, promising to spend the rest of my life with him. I never thought I'd agree to marry a man I didn't love. But when my mother sat me down 3 months after my father's funeral, tears streaming down her face, I knew I had no real choice. She held an envelope with my father's handwriting on it, shaky, written in his final days. Inside was a single request: honor the arrangement he'd made with the Cole family. My father believed this marriage would protect our family's future and keep his promises intact. I didn't understand what promises he meant, but I couldn't say no to a dying man's wish. So I agreed. Adrian Cole. I'd met him once at a business dinner years ago. He was quiet, serious, with dark eyes that seemed to see through everything. Now he was going to be my husband. The wedding was small and cold. I wore my mother's old dress, altered to fit me. Adrian stood at the altar in a black suit, his face unreadable. When the priest asked if I took him as my husband, I hesitated for only a second before whispering, "I do." He didn't smile. Neither did I. We were strangers bound by a promise I didn't fully understand yet. After the ceremony, Adrian drove me to his family's estate on the outskirts of town. The house was enormous. Gray stone walls, tall windows, and gardens that stretched into the distance. It should have felt grand, but instead it felt empty, cold. He led me inside without saying much. The hallways were lined with old paintings of people I didn't know. Everything smelled faintly of wood polish and silence. He showed me to a bedroom on the second floor. It was beautiful. A large bed with soft white sheets, a window overlooking the garden, private bathroom. "This is your room," he said quietly. "You'll have your privacy." I wanted to ask why we weren't sharing a room, but the words stuck in my throat. He stood in the doorway for a moment, as if he wanted to say something, then simply nodded and left. I sat on the bed, staring at the closed door, feeling more alone than I ever had. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about the man downstairs, my husband, and wondering if I just made the biggest mistake of my life. Days that followed were painfully quiet. Adrian left the house early every morning, sometimes before I even woke up. He'd return late at night, always looking tired. We ate dinner together in the large dining room, but he rarely spoke. I tried asking him about his work, his day, anything to break the silence. His answers were always short. It was fine. Nothing important. Just business. I started to feel invisible, like I was living in a museum instead of a home. But there was one thing that kept catching my attention: a door at the end of the hallway on the 3rd floor. It was always locked. I'd passed it several times, and once, I thought I heard something inside. Soft music maybe. Or voices. I couldn't tell. One evening, I finally gathered the courage to ask, "Adrian, what's behind that locked door upstairs?" He was reading a book in the study. When I spoke, his whole body went stiff. He looked up at me, his face suddenly hard. "That room is private," he said firmly. "Please don't go near it." And that was the end of the conversation. Weeks passed, and I still felt like a stranger in my own marriage. But I started noticing small things about Adrian, things that didn't match the cold, distant man he seemed to be. Sometimes, I'd find a cup of tea waiting for me in the morning, still warm. Or a book I'd mentioned wanting to read would appear on my nightstand. He never said anything about these gestures, and I never asked. One morning, I saw him coming out of the bathroom with a towel, wrapped around his waist. There was a long, deep scar across his shoulder, jagged and old. It looked like it had been painful. "How did you get that?" I asked before I could stop myself. He paused, his jaw tightening. For a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said quietly, "Some things are better left in the past." His voice wasn't angry. It was sad. That was the first time I saw real emotion in his eyes. Pain, regret, something heavy. And suddenly, I wanted to know everything. Not because I was nosy, but because I realized Adrian wasn't just distant. He was hurting. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about the scar, the locked room, the silence between us. Around midnight, I heard footsteps downstairs. I got out of bed and crept to the hallway. Adrian was in his study, talking on the phone. His voice was tense, almost angry. "No," he said sharply. "I told you no more. She doesn't know anything, and it needs to stay that way." I froze on the stairs, my heart pounding. She doesn't know anything. Was he talking about me? "I don't care what they want," he continued. "I made my choice. She's not part of this." The call ended abruptly. I heard him slam something down on the desk. I hurried back to my room, before he could catch me listening. But sleep didn't come. My mind raced with questions. What didn't I know? Who was he protecting me from? And what choice had he made? The next morning, he acted completely normal. Polite. Distant. As if the phone call had never happened. But I couldn't forget it. Something was very wrong, and I was starting to realize my father's arrangement wasn't as simple as I'd thought. A few days later, I was cleaning Adrian's study while he was out. I wasn't trying to snoop. I just wanted to feel useful. But when I opened the bottom drawer of his desk to dust inside, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was an old photograph, faded and creased. It showed Adrian much younger, standing beside a woman I didn't recognize. And next to her was my father. They were all standing in front of a building I'd never seen before. They looked serious. And this wasn't a casual photo. When I heard footsteps behind me, jump. Adrian stood in the doorway, his face pale. "Where did you find that?" he asked, his voice sharp. I was just cleaning," I stammered, holding the photo out. He crossed the room in 2 long steps and took it from my hands. "You shouldn't have seen this." "Adrian, what is this? Why is my father in this picture with you?" He didn't answer. He just stared at the photo for a long moment, then folded it carefully and put it in his pocket. "Forget you saw this," he said quietly, then walked out of the room. My hands were shaking. Whatever connection he had to my father, it went much deeper than I'd imagined. That night, I couldn't stay quiet anymore. I found Adrian in the living room, staring into the fireplace. "I deserve to know the truth," I said, my voice trembling. "Why was my father in that photo? What's going on?" He stood up, his face hard. "Some things are better left alone." "No," I said, surprising myself with my own firmness. "You can't keep shutting me out. I'm your wife, I have a right to know." For the first time he raised his voice. "Your father wasn't the man you think he was." The words hit me like a slap. "What does that mean?" He turned away, running a hand through his hair. "It means he made choices that hurt people. Good people. And I've been trying to protect you from the consequences ever since." I felt tears burning in my eyes. Protect me from what? Before he could answer, a loud crack of thunder shook the house. The lights flickered, then went out completely. We stood in the darkness, both breathing hard. And in that silence, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't afraid of Adrian. I was afraid of the truth he was hiding. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about what Adrian had said. I needed answers, and I knew where to find them. I went to my father's old study, a small room my mother had kept exactly as he'd left it. I searched through his desk, his files, his old briefcase. And finally I found it. An envelope with my name written on it in his handwriting. My hand shook as I opened it. Inside was a letter dated just weeks before he died. "My dearest daughter," it began. "If you're reading this, then you've married Adrian Cole. I know you must have questions. Years ago I made a terrible mistake. I was involved in a business deal that went wrong. My partner's family suffered because of my choices. Adrian's father went to prison for something I should have been held accountable for. I was a coward. This marriage is my attempt to make peace, to protect you from the anger and pain I caused. Adrian is a good man. Trust him. He has every reason to hate our family, but he chose mercy instead. Forgive me for the burden I've placed on you both." The letter fell from my hands. Tears streamed down my face. Everything finally made sense. That evening, I confronted Adrian with the letter. I found him in his study, and I didn't knock. I just walked in and placed the letter on his desk. "I know," I said quietly. "I know what my father did." He looked at the letter, then at me. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then he sighed deep and heavy, and finally told me everything. His father had been my father's business partner. When a deal went bad, my father blamed everything on Adrian's father to save himself. Adrian's father went to prison. His mother died from the stress. Adrian grew up with nothing, watching his family fall apart. "I hated your father for years," he admitted, his voice raw. "When he reached out to me before he died, asking me to marry you, I almost refused. But then I met you at that dinner years ago. You were kind, innocent. You had nothing to do with what he'd done." He looked at me with tired, sad eyes. "I couldn't punish you for his mistakes. So I agreed, not for revenge, but to keep you safe from the people who still blame your family." I sat down, overwhelmed. "You married me to protect me." He nodded. "And to honor a promise I made to a dying man, even though I hated him." The next day, I asked him about the locked room again. This time he didn't refuse. He led me upstairs and unlocked the door. Inside was a small, simple room filled with memories. Paintings on the walls, a box of old letters, a single photograph of a woman holding a baby, Adrian's mother holding him. "This is where I come when it gets too hard," he said softly. "When I need to remember where I came from, who I lost." I looked at him, and for the first time, I saw him completely. Not as a stranger, not as my distant husband, but as a man carrying grief and guilt, trying his best to be good despite everything life had taken from him. "I'm sorry," I whispered, "for what my father did, for what you lost." He shook his head. "It wasn't your fault. But you've been carrying this alone." He looked at me, then really looked at me, and something shifted between us. "Not anymore," he said quietly. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't just living with a stranger anymore. I was standing beside someone who had sacrificed more than I ever knew, for me. After that night, everything changed. We started eating breakfast together, talking more. He told me about his mother, his childhood, the years he spent rebuilding his life after losing everything. I told him about my own fears, my grief over my father, my guilt for not knowing what kind of man he really was. Slowly, the house began to feel different, warmer. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was comfortable. I caught him smiling once while we cooked dinner together. It was small, barely there, but it was real. And it made my heart flutter in a way I didn't expect. I started noticing other things too. The way he always checked to make sure I'd eaten. How he'd leave the porch light on when I stayed up late reading. The way his eyes softened when he looked at me. I was falling for him, not because I had to. Not because of duty or obligation. But because I finally saw who Adrian really was underneath all the pain and silence. He was kind, strong, forgiving. And he had chosen to love me even when he had every reason not to. Months later, I was helping Adrian organize files in his study when I found one last piece of the puzzle. It was a letter my father had written to Adrian years before he died. One Adrian had never mentioned. Adrian, it read. I know I have no right to ask anything of you. But please take care of her like your own. You are the son I wish I had. The man I failed to be. I trust you with the most precious thing I have left. When I showed it to Adrian, his face crumbled. For the first time since I'd known him, he cried. I held him as he broke down, all the years of pain and forgiveness finally pouring out. He didn't deserve you, I whispered. But I'm grateful he brought us together. Adrian pulled back and looked at me, his eyes red but clear. I didn't marry you out of obligation, he said. Not anymore. I choose you every day. Because you're not just my wife. You're the person who taught me I could heal. I kissed him then, soft and sure, and realized the truth. This marriage, this strange, painful, beautiful arrangement, had become the greatest love I'd ever known. Though it started as a strange arrangement, the end, I discovered it was a blessing. My hidden revenge stories you haven't seen yet. Check links to playlist in the description. Subscribe so you don't miss daily real-life revenge stories from this channel.